So in reading Cicero today, we're reading the words of someone who is frantically trying to convince his audience and trying to convince himself that the glory of Rome still lies in the future, when tragically he already knows within his own lifetime the glory of Rome already lies in the past. It's a very poorly written work. The author works very, very hard to make his ideas immortal. All of the moments when Cicero as an author is trying to be the most earnest and the most awe-inspiring, to summon up this great sense of religiosity and of historical depth of importance, is when today it is just laughable. He's not offering you democracy. He's offering you the name of democracy, rubber stamped onto what's really an absolutely horrible system of government. For a lot of you, this may sound like it comes out of left field. There's a politically loaded phrase. Right out of left field. If we're going to have a sincere discussion about the legacy and influence of Cicero, I think we have to start by asking, what is the value of an aristocracy? What is the role of aristocracy in our society supposed to be? And then what did it ever mean to these historical authors? So to give you guys a quick recap, Cicero is one of the most influential political philosophers in the history of the world. And today, nobody reads him. It's kind of mind-blowing. We had real difficulty finding a copy at the library. We went to the library. You will have difficulty even finding a consistent title for this book. It's normally titled something like On the Republic, On the Roman Republic. It could be On the State or On the Nature of Government. Like, there were a few different kind of titles circulating. And that was true in the Middle Ages for major works by like Plato and Aristotle. There'd be more than one title. But then at some point in the scholarship, we settled on a standard modern title, which is not just standard in English, but normally the same title be used in all European languages. So I think everyone knows this is what's the most important work by Cicero. It's one of the most important works in the history of Western civilization. Would it be too much to say there's a kind of embarrassment about it? I had the very strange experience that I was starting to read Cicero at the time when I had just been studying the history of the English Civil War. And it was astonishing to read Cicero's rationale, Cicero's philosophy of government, being used word for word perfectly in justifying basically what we would call the divine right of kings in British history, the debate between the British king and Parliament, ultimately about whether or not the king should be decapitated. Although, in principle, I think at that stage of the trial, it hadn't quite come to that point yet. It was more of a broad debate about what should be the role of king, what should be the role of society, and what should be the limited role of democracy in ruling the British people. So at that time, just to stick with this example, the King of England employed the argument straight out of Cicero that what his government represented, his form of ruling England, what it represented was not monarchy. It was a balance of the three essential aspects of government: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Now, I really feel that Cicero is the first great example we have of a completely insincere demagogue writing propaganda that quite intentionally abuses the name of democracy, or gives you a sham democracy, with absolutely no sincere interest in the people having any say in government, put it that way. Now, in our own times, I remember this with one of my ex-girlfriends especially. She'd always be confused, and she would think North Korea was South Korea, because, the communist countries would always have democracy in their names, People's Democratic Republic of Korea. She'd think, oh, well, that must mean South Korea, because that's the democratic one. No. Laos, still communist to this day, still with the Communist Party. The Lao People's Democratic Republic, right? And back in the day, this was no joke. Back in the 1980s, communists and fellow travelers and Fabian socialists, they'd all say, like, well, how do you define democracy anyway? Yeah, Right. So there was a lot of really insincere, propagandistic, one-sided, selective definitions of democracy during my youth, in the era of the kind of fever pitch contest between capitalism and communism. And very, very little of that discussion was sincere. To give a contrasting example, by the way, in the autobiography of Richard Nixon, President of the United States, an autobiography hilariously titled "No More Vietnams," meaning no more wars like the Vietnam War. He remarks, well, a lot of people said that when we had this colony, when we occupied, when we dominated part of Vietnam, it also wasn't a legitimate democracy. And he responds to this criticism, I'm paraphrasing, of course. He said, well, when we controlled Vietnam, there was some democracy, and there were some elections. Maybe they were badly flawed, maybe they were legitimate. He said, but after the communists took over, there were none. That's about as honest as Richard Nixon gets. That's about that particular historical figure. That's as honest as he's going to get with you. So my point being, on both sides of the Cold War, there was a lot of very insincere manipulation of the concept of democracy. Now, I disagree with Aristotle about the nature of democracy. I disagree with Plato about the nature of democracy. I probably disagree with Socrates about the truth be told. We don't have that much to go with. Definitely, Thucydides. I have more respect for Thucydides than maybe any other single author from ancient Athens. I totally disagree with him about the core issue of democracy. But I think all of those guys were being completely sincere. And what Cicero is engaging in is a fabrication. So of those three elements, monarchy, so I was going to say monarchy, anarchy. That would be a different philosophy of government. If we're a monarchy, anarchy, and democracy, monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, right? So I opened this by saying, if we're going to take Cicero's contribution to history seriously, what we really have to ask is, what is the positive contribution of the aristocrats to society? Now, today, in the United States of America, there are no aristocrats in the formal sense, but there is a millionaire class, there is a billionaire class. And I think everyone, left or right, really assumes that those people are basically social parasites, that the majority of their wealth is just devoted to their own entertainment, their own self-indulgence, that they don't have any particular commitment to national well-being, that they are not the leaders of society, put it that way. That it's extraordinary and exceptional and is to be celebrated if any of them has a spirit of public service and self-sacrifice. We expect millionaires to live the way Donald Trump lived in the 1980s, which, again, I can remember very well. He was on the cover of Playboy magazine. He utterly, flagrantly represented himself to the public as a reckless, feckless, self-indulgent millionaire who cheated on his wife while going skiing and was photographed, cheating on his wife. This was a famous event at the time. There was absolutely no pretense of him having, shall we say, any Spartan values, let alone any Athenian values. This is the assumption we have of the 21st century equivalent to the aristocratic class. And now I think if you go to a country where technically aristocrats still exist, the Netherlands, England, and you ask people, what do you think about aristocrats and what is their positive role in society? You're going to get a lot of confused silence. What? So what, people who just happen to own land because their ancestors were wealthy, why would I expect anything positive from them? Well, in England, they still fill the House of Lords. They have two chambers of government there, the equivalent of the Congress and the Senate. Their upper house, the equivalent of the Senate, the House of Lords, those are all people who were in there because of who their ancestors were, because they were born rich, So if you don't believe they have a special role to play as leaders of society, you have a very strange artifact of exactly, that was that King of England's theory, that his model of government reconciled democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy, that it was all three in balance, that it was a hybrid government, which is what Cicero promises also. Now, however, if we go back to that era of the English Civil War, I think this is one of the distinctive elements of modernity in contrast to pre-modernity, Middle Ages, Renaissance, etc. It is very clear that the role of the aristocrat in pre-modern Europe was at all times to prepare for war. They would breed horses, they'd raise horses, they'd be stockpiling the munitions of war. They would be training in sword and lance, and they would be training the peasants to fight with bow and arrow. All throughout England, this is a standard thing for centuries and centuries. All of the tallest men, even from the small towns and villages, the peasants, would be recruited to be trained with the longbow. You had to be tall to use a longbow, All the tallest men of England became longbowmen. Why? Even when there was no war. Well, sooner or later there'd be a war. There'd be a war with France, there'd be a war with Spain, there'd be a civil war within England. Constant military preparedness. That was the role of the aristocratic class, historically, in Europe. If we're talking about history of China or history of Japan, maybe there are some other concepts there. So, in that sense, it's very clear. In the long centuries of Cicero's influence, which were exactly the centuries after the collapse of the Roman Empire, when people tried to look back at Rome and say, hey, what was the ideal of government? What was the mode of organization of government that made the Roman Empire so successful, including, obviously, the thing just about the material quality of life, but also military success and, managed to unify such a huge area politically and so on, administrative success, bureaucratic success in every kind. You're in the Dark Ages in English, and even into the Renaissance, looking back at what ancient Rome accomplished and thinking, how was it they did this, and we're incapable of it? We're this bunch of tiny, fragmentary Christian states that all hate each other, that can barely scramble together to get organized to fight off invasions from the Mongols, for example, or what have you. Why is it that we're just so barely able to organize lunch now? And they looked to Cicero for that inspiration, that guidance. Now, what did Cicero think was the positive role of aristocrats in society? I'll give you my original thesis here, which is completely based on silence. I think an honest reading of Cicero, in the context of Aristotle, because in many ways it's building on and responding to Aristotle, I think that Cicero's real implicit thesis is, if you do not have a system of government that is pleasing to the aristocrats, they will just take it over anyway. I think that's the real honest truth, is that he lived at a time when the aristocrats in reality had all of the power, they had all of the wealth, they had the means to at any time depose even the emperor of Rome, and replace him with someone of their choosing. So you needed at all times, within Rome, the reality of what Rome was during his lifetime, you needed a system of government that was at all times pandering to, for lack of a better word, the aristocratic class. And it was basically out of fear that aristocrats would take away democracy, or even just take away, shall we say, professional government and replace it with dictatorship. Take away, the trappings of, a properly organized constitutional republic. There's a loaded term in 2019, that they take away your constitutional republic and rule by other means, because aristocrats at all times had the power to do that. And throughout Italy, not necessarily just within Rome, they had lots of examples of that all the time, of aristocrats directly taking over power. Now, that is an incredibly bleak view of democracy, that democracy is, in a sense, always held hostage by the elite class of the society you're living in, and you're in the position of like a hostage negotiator, trying to bargain for whatever the conditions of the other classes will be, and that ultimately even the monarch, who is just one man, or in Rome, we have titles like emperors and so on, is someone who is quite powerless compared to the people who ultimately own the horses and organize and educate and raise up the peasants and train them with bow and arrow. Okay, so conclusions on Cicero's Republic. It's a very poorly written work. The author works very, very hard to make his ideas immortal by throwing in a lot of religious material that today is incomprehensible and impossible to sympathize with. Indeed, it is tragicomic to read the text today, because all of the moments when Cicero as an author is trying to be the most earnest and the most awe-inspiring, to summon up this great sense of religiosity and of historical depth of importance, is when today it is just laughable. And then on the other hand, when he is dealing with politics, the real questions of politics, political organization, democracy, so on and so forth. He is being evasive. He is being dishonest. He is trying to manipulate the audience in a manner where if you're just kind of taking notes on a sheet of graph paper, if you're even just like trying to draw a diagram on graph paper of what this system of government is, like when he promises you a balance of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, and you're like, wait. So where in this system is the democracy again? It's that easy to refute. I mean, it's that obvious, the nature of the deception, the fabric of lies, that he's not offering you democracy. He's offering you the name of democracy, rubber stamped onto what's really an absolutely horrible system of government. It's very hard for anyone to accept. It was hard for Cicero in his own life to accept, and I just mentioned, we can't get into this, his own life was tragic. The political circumstances he was writing that book in are tragic. He was trying to be optimistic about a Roman Empire that was getting more and more dictatorial, let's put it that way, less and less democratic, less and less of a real constitutional republic, even during his lifetime, and after he dies it only gets worse. That already when he's alive, it seems like Rome's glory days are behind them, or at least, again, to use a totally alien concept in terms of like rule of law and human rights and things like that Rome is getting worse and worse. The small role for democracy is disappearing. So in reading Cicero today, we're reading the words of someone who is frantically trying to convince his audience and trying to convince himself that the glory of Rome still lies in the future, when tragically he already knows within his own lifetime the glory of Rome already lies in the past. It is certainly mysterious. It's not that it's mysterious. It is hard for people to deal with today, the idea that Rome was quote-unquote great just due to material circumstance. That the fact that the Roman Empire was as successful as it was is just as arbitrary and meaningless and brutal and uninspiring as the fact that one dynasty after another happened to win during a certain period of the history of China. It's very difficult for Europeans to study the history of Europe with that level of detachment, where they're even willing to look at Rome as a phenomenon, as something amoral, if not immoral, as a disaster rather than a triumph. But to really examine Cicero and the legacy of his influence on Western European civilization, it is every bit as sickening as studying Communist Party documents that completely insincerely try to convince you that the reason why they're torturing people to death and throwing them in prison for asking for elections, the reason why nobody can ever have elections, even though the Constitution of China promises you elections, promises that everyone can vote. Same with even Russia after Lenin's revolution, 1917. The reason why they were hunting down and murdering everyone who participated in the elections, that the reason for that is democracy. It's just as sickening to study the original text and the influence of the sham democracy that Cicero propounded as it is to study the sham democracy of historical communism.